Well, good morning, and thank you for the very kind invitation to be here today. It's great to be back in Saskatoon. And if you read my bio, you realize I've spent most of my career in communications. And one of the things you learn very early in communications is how critically important it is to get the right message to the right audience at the right time. And so I'm going to work very hard to do that this morning, but I was reminded just how important that is a while ago when we moved into some new office space in Kansas City. And we were plugging computers in and unpacking, getting desks set up and that kind of activity. And somebody sent us a nice floral display. And I thought, well, that's kind of nice. You know, one of our vendors or customers or somebody recognized we moved into new space and they sent us some flowers. So I went over and I picked up the card and I opened it and it said, "With our deepest sympathies." And I thought, well, that's kind of odd. I've got some odd friends, but nobody quite that odd, I didn't think. And so I called the florist and I said, hey, I really appreciate you sending these, but I'm not really sure they were supposed to come to us. And he said, well, let me look into it and I'll call you back. And so we continued to unpack and plug computers in, set phones up, that kind of activity. And phone rang and it was the florist. He called back. He goes, gosh, I'm so terribly sorry. He goes, those weren't supposed to come to you. We have yours. We'll bring them right over. And I said, not a problem. I've run a small business. I understand how those things can happen. And he said, well, actually, it's a bit more serious than that. He said, your flowers went to the funeral home with a card that said, congratulations on your new location. So it really is important to get the right message to the right audience at the right time. We're going to do that today, talking about how to build trust in your products, your processes, and your people. Many things have changed in agriculture over the last 20 years, and it's important for us to continue to change and adapt as we want to think about how we're going to continue to earn and maintain our social license. Just a bit of background on the Center for Food Integrity. We are a not-for-profit organization dedicated to building trust and confidence in the food system. Spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you at the end of the presentation about the new Canadian Center for Food Integrity in collaboration with Farm and Food Care Canada and Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan that will be launched later this year. So some more details about that coming up. But again, our mission to build consumer trust and confidence, our vision to facilitate that dialogue with consumers and really try to close the gap between consumer expectation and industry performance. What can we do to do a better job of meeting consumer expectations? How do we do a better job of engaging with consumers to modify and change their perception? Our members and representatives, 150 project partners and members, represent every sector of the food system. So our board of directors includes the World Wildlife Fund, as well as the National Restaurant Association, Grocery Manufacturers Association, producer organizations, and really folks representing the entire food system, including universities and state governments. So today's food system generally is safer, more available, and more affordable than ever before. And that really is a tribute to you. It's a tribute to the men and women who've been involved in agriculture over the last many decades, responsibly applying technology to allow us to continue to produce more with less. And yet, despite that, consumers continue to have more questions and are more skeptical than they've ever been before, which tends to be a source of great frustration for those involved in agriculture. Because you know you're committed to doing what's right, you're out there working hard every day, and yet you continue to get that pushback from those who are more skeptical. So how did that happen? How did we get to the point that we have a food system that is safe, reliable, and affordable, and yet not necessarily trusted by consumers who continue to raise questions and continue to express their skepticism about who we are and what we do? We can actually trace the start of that all the way back to 1968, believe it or not. Coming out of World War II in the 1950s in North America, there tended to be a broad sense of social optimism. The shared sacrifice of the greatest generation kind of united all of us, and we were all pulling together in the same direction. All of that began to change and erode in the 1960s, and it culminated in 1968. And while most of these illustrations are American-specific, U.S.-specific, think about how they apply to the Canadian context as well, where we saw violations of trust that ultimately resulted in perhaps the challenges we see today in the food system. Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Martin Luther King Jr. were both assassinated in 1968, two rising stars raising the spectrum of political violence that we'd never seen before. We had the Democratic National Convention in 1968 in Chicago, where there were actually protests on the floor of the convention that resulted in physical conflict, and Mayor Daley in Chicago actually unleashed police and troops to quash protesters who were protesting the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was in full bloom, as was opposition to the war, and many Americans came to Canada to avoid the draft, as that resulted in significant social controversy across North America and across campuses and other places all around the country. But there's also another interesting analogy about what happened during the Vietnam War and what we're seeing today in agriculture. Prior to the Vietnam War, the military had done an excellent job of controlling messages and images related to military activity. They had really limited access to what was taking place. And what we saw from World War II and earlier conflicts was about newsreels and propaganda and press releases that the military had set out. But with the advent of evening television news, all of that fundamentally changed, because now we began to see what was taking place on the battlefield every single night. And that fundamentally changed the whole conversation about military action and has done the same ever since. So the military did what was probably anticipated at that point in time. They worked harder to control. They tried more to limit access and to limit information, hoping that they could put that genie back in the bottle and that access to information would no longer be available. It didn't work. And today the military has actually gone to the point that they are embedding journalists with troops when they go to the battlefield. We find ourselves in a somewhat similar situation in agriculture, where historically we've tried very hard to control the images and the messages and the information we share about who we are and what we do. But today, in today's social media and digital communication environment, control is an illusion. It's no longer possible. When anybody who has a cell phone can be a cinematographer, we really have to operate assuming that someone could be watching everything we do all the time. And if we're not comfortable with that, then we need to ask ourselves why. Christmas Eve of 1968, the first time we saw a picture of the Earth from outer space, and all of a sudden a recognition that the resources we have on this blue planet are shared and quite limited, and it really became an iconic image for the environmental movement and continues to be one today. You follow that up with the tragic shooting at Kent State University, where 4 students were killed in 1970 as they were protesting the Vietnam War, and then the Watergate break-in, which ultimately led to the resignation of President Nixon. The first time a U.S. president had resigned from office shook confidence in our democratic process to its very core, as people really began to fundamentally ask questions about whether or not their elected leaders and the election process was any longer worthy of public trust. Other events in the 1970s and 80s, you begin to see the cascade of violations of trust, whether it's the Iran-Contra scandal in 1986, where again questions were raised about political motivations, the integration of military, and whether or not our political leaders could be trusted. 2 violations from the energy sector, 3 Mile Island and Exxon Valdez, and 2 of the first of many violations of public trust from the religious sector with Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker, both brought down by sex scandals, and of course the tragedies that have taken place in the Catholic Church and the reaction to that as well. 1998, we had a second president who was impeached but not convicted after the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, and then the tech bubble burst after Arthur Andersen and Enron, and the scandal there where all those who were responsible for watching what was taking place in big business, the accountants, clearly violated the public trust as those at Enron continued to manipulate the books to inflate their stock price. Other events in the 2000s, whether it's Abu Ghraib, John Edwards, Elliot Spitzer, or Tiger Woods, again, reflections of those who have leadership positions or high-profile public positions violating the public trust and raising questions about whether or not those in those positions and the institutions they represent are actually worthy of public trust. The subprime mortgage collapse in 2008, Lehman Brothers going out of business and others, and really the trigger for the global financial crisis, which some parts of the world are still struggling with today. We've seen phenomenal volatility just over the last couple of weeks in the U.S. stock market, and of course you can appreciate the devaluation of the Canadian currency that's currently causing crisis and concern about rising food prices here in Canada. Other events in the 2000s, the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and Tony Hayward, their CEO, relatively tone deaf to what was taking place down there when he was interviewed about whether or not he wanted the situation to end, said, "Of course I want this over, I want my life back," completely ignoring the millions of people in the Gulf who were impacted by it directly as he got back on his private jet and went to his polo pony matches, quickly to be relieved of his position. And then, of course, the tragedies at Penn State University, where the long-standing sexual abuse by a football coach and the institutional cover-up of that. So you begin to see the pattern of violations of public trust by a variety of institutions over the last 45 years, whether they be government or military or media, political leaders, whatever it happens to be, big business being one of those. You begin to see those violations of public trust, which creates an overall culture of skepticism about whether or not institutions and those who lead them are in fact worthy of trust. And food is so incredibly different than any other thing we deal with in our lives. It is deeply, deeply personal. We need it for survival. Global conflict is both the cause and effect of food insecurity. In places where we see food insecurity, we frequently see global conflict. And in areas where there's global conflict, we frequently see food insecurity. We feed it to our children. We provide it to those who are most vulnerable among us. And mothers and others who have that responsibility feel a special obligation to make sure they're doing what's right, and they're not exactly sure about how to define what's right in today's environment. And it's part of our culture and celebrations. Rarely do we gather at any time that it doesn't involve a meal, an opportunity to sit down and break bread together, share stories, build relationships. And I can certainly tell you over the holidays that my conversion rate was probably better than any animal in Saskatchewan. 2.5 pounds a day, almost guaranteed between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So over that last 45-year period of time, where we've been taught to be very skeptical about whether or not institutions are worthy of trust, we've seen consolidation, integration, and the application of technology in agriculture and the food system, which has made food safer, more available, and more affordable than ever before. But it's also led to that growing public belief that today we too have become an institution. And therefore, like other institutions, people question whether or not we are worthy of trust. And that leads to some fairly significant frustration on your part because you know that your values haven't changed. Your systems have changed dramatically because you continue to apply technology in a responsible way to allow you to produce more using less, to take better care of the environment, to take better care of the animals, to make sure you're doing right by consumers. And yet that continues not to be the public perception because of that change that we've seen socially over the last 45 years. So some fairly important social shifts. It used to be that authority was granted primarily by office. If you held an office, if you held a title, or you'd been elected to a position, people would defer to you and grant you authority. Today, authority is granted primarily by relationship, and that's never been more true than through social media. The groups to whom you belong and the people with whom you associate on social media oftentimes influence to whom you will grant authority. We used to have very broad social consensus driven primarily by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. Today, there is no single social consensus, great diversity, and many voices. And I can tell you that some of our members that are in the food system, those in the farther up in the chain, are struggling to understand which of those voices should influence our procurement decisions. Which of those voices should influence whether or not we allow growth promotants to be used in beef production? Which of those voices should influence whether or not we allow antibiotics to be used in livestock production? So they're struggling to figure out exactly how to interpret today's changing conversation. Communication used to be very formal and indirect, mass communication. I grew up in rural Nebraska, and when the weather was good, we got 3 television stations. But today, we have transitioned from mass communication to masses of communicators, where it's gone from being very formal and indirect to very informal and very direct and oftentimes even confrontational, where everyone has an opportunity to participate in that conversation, whether or not they have an informed decision or whether or not they have any academic information or scientific information upon which it's based. It's not required, knowledge is not required to participate in that conversation or discussion. And rather than connecting all of us so we've got this great global conversation, instead the internet has created these infinite number of tribes of special interest, where each of us tends to sort and sift that infinite amount of information in a way that makes it directly relevant to us, which is a good thing because otherwise there's simply no way that we could manage that amount of information flow. But I'd be willing to bet $100, $100 US dollars today, that if I took a look at the smartphones of everyone in this room, no two would be identical because each of us has chosen apps and people to follow and sources of information to allow us to organize and make use of that infinite information flow. And that's great, except that it causes us to be limited in our perspective. We always tend to follow those voices that tend to reinforce our existing worldview, and we tend to look for people who believe the way we believe, think the way we think, and have the kind of information we believe is directly relevant to us. That's helpful, but it limits our perspective, and it limits the opportunity to have broader social conversation on challenging issues like what should be in our food, how should it be produced, and what kind of impact are we willing to accept on the environment. We've always believed that progress is inevitable. An additional tenth of gain, if you do the sensitivity analysis on that, you understand what it means to the bottom line. And so being able to apply technology to make that happen is something that we've always celebrated. But others believe that progress is possible, and what we define as progress may not be the same definition as others. And it used to be that institutions were respected and trusted. Those who belonged to those institutions were certainly respected. But today, increasingly, institutions are not trusted and people are increasingly skeptical. So some fairly important shifts over the last 45 years that create a very different environment for us today as we think about how we maintain that social license and protect our freedom to operate. Because what you do in agriculture, what you do in the beef industry is crucially important to society. But how we go about maintaining that social license is going to require us to think differently than we've ever thought before. All of the work that we do at the Center for Food Integrity is based on our peer-reviewed and published model for building trust. And at the very bottom right-hand side of the screen there, you can see freedom to operate. And if you're directly involved in the cattle industry in Saskatchewan, that's something that's really important to you. Your ability to do what you do best with a minimum amount of outside interference. Today, that consistently requires that we earn and maintain a social license, which we define as the privilege of operating with minimal formalized restrictions based on maintaining public trust. If the public trusts you to do what's right, they won't put pressure on regulators or legislators to change what happens. And today what we see happening more frequently is rather than legislators or regulators making those decisions are coming from the marketplace, where large branded food companies are saying, I no longer want that input, I no longer want that process, I no longer want that ingredient made part of my supply chain, make it go away. And when that happens, there's no promulgation process, there's no public hearing, there's no stakeholder gathering, it just goes away. So we're beginning to see how that power in the marketplace is now shifting from legislators and regulators to the market. And public trust is a belief that our activities are consistent with social expectations, the values of the community, and other stakeholders. And one of the reasons we do extensive consumer research every single year is to better understand how are those societal expectations evolving, and then how do we do a better job of making sure we're aligned with them as we move forward. And I think I can make a fairly compelling economic case for investing in social license, because if I can't, you shouldn't do it. At the end of the day, you're in business. And if this doesn't add to the bottom line or help you prevent adding additional cost, it really isn't worth your investment. But when you operate with a social license, it's a system that is lower cost, more responsive, and very flexible. But you're only granted that if you operate in a way consistent with the ethics, values, and expectations of your stakeholders, and you've got some kind of self-regulatory mechanism in place to demonstrate you're doing what's right. Then once you cross that tipping point, either because of a single event or a series of events, undercover videos, food safety incident, large brand making a decision, then you move to social control, which is much more rigid, much more bureaucratic, and higher cost. All about legislation, regulation, litigation, and compliance. So I'm going to give you an illustration of that from my personal experience. My guess is, as you think about environmental requirements in the livestock industry today, you can see how that's played out for you specifically already over time. But I spent 11 years in the pork industry before I moved into working with the Center for Food Integrity and others. And while I was there, we were building a very large farm very quickly. At our fastest, we were building a barn and a quarter every single day. Not everything went well. Over a period of time, we had a series of manure spills. The state of Missouri came in and said, you have violated the public trust. We no longer trust you to manage the nutrients in swine waste, so we're going to change the regulatory scheme so there's more governmental oversight. So we knew from our benchmarking service then that our cost of environmental compliance was 6 times the cost of our competitors in other states. So we made ourselves significantly less competitive because we'd violated the social license and public trust, and we saw additional regulations put in place. 2 other things that I'd like to address about this before I move on. First of all, they didn't change the law just for us. You don't pass a law for a company, you pass a law for a sector. So every other livestock producer in Missouri was penalized because we screwed up, because we lost the social license for the entire sector. That means that your social license is dependent on every other cattle producer that's here and in Saskatchewan. And every other cattle producer is counting on you to maintain their social license. So there's significant value in working collectively to make sure that you're meeting the standards and expectations that consumers have established. The second question I frequently get from farmers on this question is, well, what are consumers willing to pay for that? The answer is nothing. There's no premium for doing what's right. There's a penalty for violating social license, but there's no premium for meeting basic social expectations. It's your privilege to continue to operate if you do so. And you can see the number of issues that are challenging your social license today. Clearly, it could be tied to biotechnology. Could be tied to the potential impact on climate change that the cattle and beef industry may be having. Might be tied to public health, where people are saying that red meat and most recently processed meat is a potential or exact carcinogen. Personally, if bacon causes cancer, I'm going to die a happy man, because I'm not giving it up, just me. And then animal welfare concerns that you see as well. So a variety of issues where consumers and the public in general, fueled by others, are increasingly concerned about whether or not what we're doing is consistent with the social license that we've been given. So if trust is the primary driver for social license, then the primary question became, what drives trust? That's a researchable question, and we partnered with Steve Sapp at Iowa State University back in 2007 and began by doing a meta-analysis on 21 different pieces of research. And in each of those, we identify the three drivers you see there on the left-hand side of the screen. At the very bottom, it's influential others. That's two groups. It's your family and friends, and credentialed individuals whose opinions you respect. Could be a dietitian, could be a doctor, could be a veterinarian. The second element in building trust is competency. That's our technical capacity in science. Now, historically, in agriculture, that's where we've spent most of our time talking about who we are and what we do. We are very science-driven, as evidenced by the presentations earlier this morning. We place a lot of value on science, we place a lot of value on data because we know those decisions have a significant impact. So our assumption is that the public is going to be logical and rational, and they'll operate in the same manner. And if they've not yet come to our side of the argument, it must mean we've not given them the right information. So we'll go do some research and then give them more information. If they still haven't come to our side of the argument, we'll go do some more research and give them more information. If they still haven't come to our side of the argument, we'll go do some more research, and then we give them more information. Because that's the way the model has always worked, assuming that if we could just find the right mix of facts and figures, we would ultimately be able to drive them to our side of the question. The third element in building trust is confidence, or the perception of shared values and ethics. Can I count on you to do what's right? So once we'd identified those three drivers, we then surveyed 6,000 consumers, and what we discovered was that shared values or confidence is 3 to 5 times more important than demonstrating technical competency in building trust. So we've had the historical communication model exactly backward, because communicating values and confidence is 3 to 5 times more important than giving people facts and data when it comes to building trust. So we have to think differently based on that peer-reviewed and published model for what it takes to build trust. I know sustainability is a difficult word to define, and it's defined and confused in a lot of different ways, but let me share with you how we define our sustainable balance. We use a triangle as the illustration for that because of its great structural integrity, strongest element known in design. And since shared values are the foundation for building trust, they too then become the foundation for the triangle. Can you authentically communicate a commitment to things like compassion, responsibility, respect, fairness, and truth? We absolutely do not abandon science. You have to have the objective, measurable, repeatable data to prove the claims you're making. And at the end of the day, if you're not economically viable, you're not truly sustainable. So we talk about sustainability being things that are economically viable, scientifically verified, and ethically grounded. But since values are the foundation for trust, they're the foundation of the triangle as well. And this tends to be where we get the conversation with the public, again, confused. Most of the questions we get today come at the base of the triangle. Should you use growth promotants? Should you use antibiotics? Should you have that many animals on the land? Should you brand? And our historical response has been, well, science says we can. Can and should aren't the same question. Can is a question about competency. Should is a question about values and ethics. Science will tell us whether or not we can. Society will tell us whether or not we should. We're very good at answering the can question. We've spent a lot of time doing that, and we've got great data. We need to get a lot better at answering the should question, because it's the should question that will ultimately determine whether or not we're granted that social license. Because when we give people information about science and economics, we increase their knowledge, we may do very little to influence how they feel or what they believe. And people are much more likely to make their decisions based on how they feel and what they believe than on simply what they know. That's why efforts to simply educate the public are not likely to be successful. We have to be willing to engage with them and participate in an ongoing dialogue so they understand that your systems have changed, but your commitment to doing what's right has never been stronger. That's increasingly important in today's radically transparent environment. It used to be that we just thought if we could control what happens up in that red bubble, production, processing, and distribution, life would be grand, and it was hard enough just to control that. But today, our customers, the processors, have direct relationships with grocery stores, restaurants, and brands who are continually getting pressure from NGOs or advocacy groups or activists, depending upon your perspective, on a variety of different issues. So when an issue bubbles up and it becomes much more engaged, all of a sudden that radically transparent environment becomes radically volatile at the speed of Twitter. And if we're not prepared to deal with that, if we haven't prepared and become more transparent and willing to engage in that conversation, it can become increasingly challenging. One of the other challenges we face is that the historical communication model is less effective in that environment. It used to be that we could just find Dr. So-and-so from hometown university, he could do the research, come down with his 2 tablets from the Mount, we'd share that information with consumers, they'd be happy and life would be grand. But it doesn't work that way in today's tribal communication environment, where consumers are crowdsourcing knowledge, where they'll go online and they'll look at a number of different websites, they'll check to see what their friends are posting on Facebook, they'll look at the news, and they'll synthesize all of those different sources and determine what's consistent with their values and what's not, and then use that process as a way to determine what they feel and how they believe about a particular topic. Let me give you an illustration of how that tribal communication works from some focus groups we did. This was a conversation we had with Heidi, who is part of a focus group in Florida, and she was talking to us about how concerned she was that GMOs were not safe for her and her family. And we said, that's interesting, Heidi. Tell us, what information sources did you use to come to that conclusion? And she said, well, I'm part of a mom's group. When there's a big consensus, I think there's something here. You don't need doctors or scientists confirming it when you have hundreds of moms. That's the world we live in today. So what does that mean to us in terms of how we choose to engage? Mommy shaming is also a big activity that takes place online today. Tribal shunning, one of those activities. Lisa mentions it here from the same focus group. She said, I think mom guilt's a huge factor. If someone is telling you something is dangerous, for example, fructose, and you hear the message more than once, you owe it to yourself to research it or quit consuming it. I can't keep giving my kids fructose if there's a potential problem. We have to do our best job. Now, a couple of different ways we might think about responding. Our first one would have been to find a couple of peer-reviewed studies on fructose, to email the links to Lisa, ask her to read them, to smarten up, for heaven's sakes. Not likely to be a particularly productive strategy, although it might be something that would be fulfilling for us. A different way to approach that same conversation would be to simply say, you know, Lisa, I really appreciate you raising that concern. It's really difficult to know exactly what to believe and what you should know about food today, and I really want to respect the fact that you want to do your best job as a mom. There's probably no more important job anywhere on the planet than being a good mother. And I know it's confusing to know what's right to do for you and your family when it comes to food today. How can we be a resource to you to help you get the information you need to make the right decisions for you and your family? We build trust with Lisa using that approach and help her begin to think about the fact that she can rely on us because we share her values. We care about the same things that are important to her. How many here are familiar with Food Babe? She's done a great job of embracing that values-based approach. Email she sent, I got it last Valentine's Day. I'm hoping I get one from her again this Valentine's Day. She said, I'm just a regular everyday person like you. So already she's identifying that, hey, I share your values. I'm someone like you. Don't let anyone ever tell you you have to be a nutritionist or scientist to figure this out. So I'm like you. We're not like them. We don't need them. We all have the ability to change our bodies, our health, and the world once we find out what's really in our food. So that approach has allowed this computer consultant with no background in food or food science, little actual knowledge, and no credentials on these issues to attract a phenomenally large following because she simply adopted that values-based approach. I want to shift gears and provide more insight now into trust-building transparency, because over the last several years we've done a lot of work on this and really believe that it's the foundation for building trust. And we tend to have a bit of a strained relationship with transparency in agriculture where, we tell people, look, we have nothing to hide, but it's none of your business. And we kind of got to get past that it's none of your business part of it. Because again, in today's environment where anybody can take a picture of anything you're doing, we have to be much more willing to be transparent. And it is the absolute crucial key to overcoming the bias against size. Part of the skepticism that people have today is related to the change in size and scale of agriculture and other institutions. We know that shared values are the foundation for building trust, but people really do believe that big is bad, and there's an inverse relationship between the size of an organization or entity and that perception of shared values. It's one of the reasons that people like small farms, the farmers market, because they feel it's more likely to be aligned with their values. Here you can see one of the statements we asked for people, their level of agreement with this statement. Essentially what this is saying that 31%, the green bar there, strongly agree that small food companies are likely to put their interest ahead of my interest. In other words, they're likely to be more self-interested than public interested. While 53% strongly agree that large food companies are likely to put their interest ahead of my interest. 28% strongly agree that small farms are likely to put their interest ahead of my interest, while 48% strongly agree that large farms are likely to put their interest ahead of my interest. So the bias against size is real. And when we asked consumers on a qualitative basis, what's it going to take for you to be less skeptical and more trusting of big farms, big food, big ag, et cetera, they said it has to be more transparent. And so we've done both qualitative and quantitative research to define that and measure it this year. Let me give you just the top line takeaways from that rather than bore you with a whole lot of charts about the data. First of all, our research does in fact prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that increasing transparency increases trust. There is a direct and measurable relationship between increasing transparency and increasing consumer trust. It really is no longer optional today. It's a basic consumer expectation. When we ask consumers, so do you feel a premium? Are you willing to pay more? You feel better about companies that are more transparent? And they said, well, yeah, that's fine. We like the companies that are more transparent. But here's the kicker. If you're not transparent, what it tells us is you either have something to hide or you don't have a good story to tell. So there's less of a premium and more of a discount if you're not willing to be transparent. Consumers primarily hold food companies responsible for transparency. We gave them 100 points of transparency allocation that they could assign to either farmers, food companies, restaurants, or retailers. And for health and nutrition, food safety, animal care, environmental impact, et cetera, they assigned most of that responsibility to food companies, which means you can expect food companies to ask you to become more transparent, as they are held more accountable for being transparent. Transparency is key to overcoming the biggest bad bias, as I mentioned. Consumers want information on your practices because practices are an illustration of your values. They're what you do. We ask them, do you want to know more about policies, practices, verification, performance? What is it you want to know more about? Third-party verification is basic table stakes for food safety and animal well-being. So they just assume that that's going to be done, and if it's not done, it raises a real question. But of all those things they want to know more about, it's your practices. What do you actually do? Sometimes character is described as the way you behave when no one is watching. They're looking for the same thing from your practices. Tell us more about what you actually do, and that encourages transparency. Consumers also want the ability to engage. They want the opportunity to ask you questions. They want you to respond in a timely manner, and they want you to provide straight talk when you answer those questions. They're really looking for straight answers and direct information. So just kind of giving you a concept about how you might be able to embrace this, and I believe the presentation is going to be saved as a PDF and distributed, so it will be made available later. But we identified these 7 different specific areas of transparency that we think could provide some indication and some guidance for you about how you might be able to incorporate these platforms into your operation. First is motivation. Act in a manner that's ethical and consistent with stakeholder interest. Show you understand and appreciate issues, and take action that demonstrates you balance public interest with self-interest. Consumers want you to be profitable. They like farmers and ranchers. They're just not sure they like farming and ranching. So they like you. So if you're out there and you're engaged and you're communicating your values and you help people understand what you're doing to balance public interest with self-interest, they're much more likely to be supportive. But they do want you to be profitable. It's not that they don't want you to make a profit. It's that they don't want you to make profit at somebody else's expense. Disclosure. Share information important to your stakeholders, both positive and negative, even if it might be damaging. Make it easy to find, helpful in making informed decisions, easy to understand, and very timely. Stakeholder engagement. This is something, again, that's a little bit foreign to us in agriculture because we're fairly accustomed to being pretty independent. We're going to make decisions about what happens on our farm and ranches based on what we want to do. And we don't really think it's anybody else's business to have input into what happens. But we need to ask those who are interested in our activities and impact for their input. We need to make it easy to provide, acknowledge it's been received, and explain how and why we make decisions. So even if we make decisions people don't agree with, if we explain how and why we came to that decision, we're much more likely to generate their support. Relevance, share information that your stakeholders deem relevant. We need to ask them what's important to them, what's relevant to them, and then show we understand. Clarity, share information that's easily understood. We need to make sure that we distill it down to language that others can understand. Credibility. Admit mistakes, apologize, accept responsibility, engage critics, share plans for corrective action, demonstrate you genuinely care, and present more than one side of controversial issues. Probably the Maple Leaf Listeria incident is the classic illustration and case study of a company that operated with phenomenal credibility during a very, very challenging time during that recall. And then finally, accuracy. Share information that is truthful, objective, reliable, and complete. There's a difference between being honest and forthcoming. Consumers want us to be forthcoming, not just honest. They're looking for more information. So as I work toward the close here, let's talk a little bit about our new reality. Wouldn't it be nice if just the facts would be persuasive? Because we know, in fact, the facts are on our side. But that's not the world in which we live today. The world in which we live today is much more complex and much more dynamic. The social decision-making process is complex and multidimensional. Decisions, unfortunately, are not made on facts and rational thought alone. Mistrust of institutions has become the social norm, as we've talked about over the last 45 years. People are much more skeptical about whether or not institutions are committed to and will, in fact, do what's right. Tribal communication, the insular communication that we described, and the relational expertise, where people assign Food Babe and others expertise based on those relationships, influences the trusted sources and trusted messages. And there's growing pressure on brands to drive social change. As you look at change.org and other platforms, you continue to see the ramped up pressure on brands to really be the folks who drive social change and to serve as the arbiters of what should happen in their supply chain. So what are the implications for you? First and foremost, understand that who you are is as important, if not more important, than what you know. Your values, your ability to communicate based on your values is so much more important than the technical information that you have to share. Your ability to talk about people and to talk about your experiences and your relationships as a mom, as a dad, as a brother, as a sister, as a third or fourth generation rancher, all of those help communicate your values and make the information you have to share much more accessible. So you don't need to be intimidated by not being a technical expert, because the conversations we're having here are not technical in nature. They're social in nature. And you're not given permission to introduce that technical knowledge until you establish that shared values connection. But people really do want to trust you. So if you participate in that conversation, people are likely to come to your side as long as you do it based on your values. Embrace skepticism. It's not personal, it's a social condition. So when people are skeptical and raising questions, do your best not to become defensive. I understand why you are. You've been doing what you've been doing for generations, and now somebody else is coming in and asking about it? How dare they? I get it. But we need to look at it in a broader perspective and understand that that defensiveness actually works against your self-interest. So embrace that skepticism and welcome those questions as an opportunity to engage, because it's much better than apathy. I would much rather someone be skeptical and asking questions than if they've already just kind of written us off and assuming anything we have to say isn't credible. The public wants information from academics, but they don't want academic information. So it's important for us to work with the academic community and make sure that we get the right information, but that we distill it to a point that it can be easily understood and digested by consumers. We have a website called bestfoodfacts.org where we have, hopefully this month, we'll hit 100,000 unique visitors who come there to get questions answered about food and a variety of different topics. And we have a network of over 150 different academics from literally all over the world who will answer those consumer questions. But part of what we do in that process is we translate PhD to ADD. So we take the very complex technical information from the academics, we interview them, we ask them if we can paraphrase, we send it back to the academics so they can approve it and make sure it's consistent with what they wanted to say, and then they give us permission to post it. But it gives us a way to make that academic information, that deep resource that we have, much more accessible, and from the response we receive, we know consumers place a high value on that. And please, as much as we would like to believe this is not the case, embrace the fact that transparency is no longer optional. The sooner you decide how you're going to be transparent, the less likely it is that someone else will make that decision for you. And so to embrace that and decide this is the direction we need to go is clearly the right decision. So finally, 3 things you can do. First of all, begin all of your public engagement using shared values. When people ask questions about what you're doing, listen for the underlying value. If they're asking questions about growth promotions or antibiotics, well, chances are what they're pretty concerned about is food safety. So what I hear you saying is that you're concerned about food safety. And as a rancher, as a farmer, I really respect that because I'm concerned about food safety too. In fact, that's why we do the things that we do on this farm. So use your values as a way to have that conversation because as former President Roosevelt said, people really don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And again, you're not given permission to introduce that technical information until you've crossed that shared values threshold. Second, open the digital door to today's beef production. Technology allows us to make information so much more available. There's an egg production company in California, JS West, which has cameras in their barns that you can access 24/7, 365 to watch their hens lay eggs. It is not must-see TV. It's just not that exciting. But what it shows people is, look, we got nothing to hide. You want to see what's going on in our barns? Go to our website. Come take a look. Put a GoPro camera on your horse. Put a GoPro camera on some cattle. Figure out ways to make information more accessible and to give people access to farm tours and other activities. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't implement the appropriate biosecurity protocols. That doesn't mean you just invite everybody to come to the farm whenever they so choose. There are legitimate reasons to limit access. But that being said, digital communication technology gives you the tools to make it much more accessible than it's ever been before. And then finally, commit to engaging early, often, and consistently. One of the many things that I respect about farmers and ranchers is your commitment to solving problems. And you're accustomed to solving problems in the cycle of production. So anytime the next cycle of production is come around, by golly, you've solved that last problem. So if you've had a problem with a particular disease, you've worked with your vet, you've worked with animal health companies, you found a solution to it. If you don't like kind of the carcass grading you're getting, by golly, you found some new genetics, you solved it, you moved on. So your expectation is that all problems can be solved in the next cycle of production. Not going to happen here. This is a generational challenge. We're going to be at this one for a while. So you need to have a longer-term vision of what success looks like and a short-term action plan. And you have a reason to expect and anticipate and demand progress from the organizations you have and you've charged with making this happen. So you want to look for those metrics, you want to hold them accountable on a regular basis, but you need to also understand that success here is about 20 years away, not 20 months. So this isn't something that's going to be solved overnight. I do want to, again, as I mentioned before, announce that the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, which will be launched housed at Farm and Food Care in collaboration with a partner here, Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan, will be launching May 31st and June 1st in Ottawa. So I would encourage you to continue to follow that, look for that information because it will be real, and we're excited about being able to collaborate with great leadership in Canada, being able to take advantage of the research and the consumer insights that we've been able to bring, and collectively we will work together across North America to continue to build trust and confidence in agriculture and our food system. It's always a privilege to be here. I thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.